Most people spend, let's say, the first 30 years of adulthood trying to better themselves with their careers with a few higher risk investments, and the last 20 or 30 years preserving the fruits of their working lives, career over, and with as little risk as possible. The skills required to create wealth are entirely different to the skills required to keep it.
This podcast is sponsored by Cadiz Inc., Nasdaq ticker symbol CDZI. Cadiz is a water company that's shown great growth over the past 2 months. Cadiz has $5 billion in water assets and the largest water pipeline in the southwest. The Cadiz ranch holds twice the amount of water as Lake Mead. Led by CEO Susan Kennedy, the former chief of staff for Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, Cadiz is eager to combat the water crisis in the southwest. Always do your own research before making any investment decisions. The information provided here is for informational purposes only and should not be considered financial advice.
Hi there and welcome to Stock Club, a podcast brought to you by MyWallSt. I'm Mike and we've got something a bit different this week. So Emmet is going to kick off the show with the rare one-man show and then myself and Anne-Marie are going to come in at the end with a little bit of big deal or no big deal. So we're just going to cover the biggest stories of the last week and a half. Before we get into the show, a reminder of our exclusive offer to our loyal listeners with the code STOCKCLUB20. You can get 20% off across our entire product line here at MyWallSt. That means 20% off Invest Plus, where you receive our weekly charging and newsletter, 10 starter foundation stocks, our market-beating stock of the month report, 20% off Horizon, our exclusive service where you can invest side by side with our chief investor, Emmet, or 20% off Nexus, our international service dedicated to uncovering hidden gems from around the world. This is a service that has returned almost 30% on average since its inception. So whatever you were in the market for, we've got you covered with the code STOCKCLUB20 at checkout. That is exclusively for our podcast listeners. Now, let's get into today's episode.
Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Emmet Savage and this is my pilot solo podcast, which, unlike all my podcasts these days, is not being recorded from my home or the MyWallSt offices in Dublin City, but instead from a hotel room in Porto in Portugal, straight onto my phone. A one-man show may appear indulgent because my stories are no more worthy of being heard than the next person's. However, as I approach a milestone birthday, I, like everyone else, have amassed a lot of experiences, some of which I think will be interesting and relevant to Stock Club listeners. I've had a couple of very unusual and fun events in my life that I'll dive into if this format proves to be successful, and one or two entirely unique occurrences that I've yet to decide, I suppose, if I want to air. I'm not recording this podcast on video, not today anyway, simply because I will probably be looking up and around or whatever I do with my eyes when accessing memories. Plus, I don't need my background to look nice. And as I said, I'm in a hotel room. There's no script, but obviously I have thought a little about themes and I've written headlines here in front of me to spark memories, keep me on track, and hopefully devise a replicable formula. I'll orientate each podcast, again, if I keep it up, around a central theme, which will either come from my private life or a short lesson I've learned somewhere along the way, or a MyWallSt story, of which, as you can imagine, I have many. What I will say is that I know what all Stock Club listeners have in common, so this show needs to appeal to them, to you. We are curious, intellectual, interested in business and the life-changing power of investing, and we all want to find and own an investment that changes our lives and creates wealth. Before I dive in, I have two asks. The first is, can you email me with a suggestion for the name of this podcast? And also, could you email if you like the format? If I get 10 people who give it a thumbs up, so to speak, via email, I'll do another. The email address is pod@mywallstreet.com. Right, let's get going. The very first headline I've written to spark my memory is the two modes of wealth. The two modes of wealth. Well, I grew up in Malahide, which is a very beautiful town in North County Dublin in Ireland, where I still go every week as my dad lives there in the village. For the sake of this conversation, I'm going to talk about the 1990s because that was the decade during which I went to college for my undergrad degree, got my first grown-up job, my first stock brokerage account, and a pile of other normal life stage events. Now, to partially set the scene, I have no siblings, and those of you who are only children know that it implies a very different developmental path, especially in Ireland in the 70s, 80s and 90s, where in true Catholic form, families were big. My father was one of 9. My mother was one of 9. My wife is one of 9. Several families from aunties and uncles around me have 9 kids. I'm surrounded by families with 9, whereas I, on the other hand, am one of 1. So unusual was it in Ireland to be an enfant unique, as they say in France, that I could tell you the name of every only child I've met in my life, which I suppose leads me to say, thankfully, I don't live in China, which would be a different story. Only kids get a full helping at home of everything good and everything imperfect. They get the undivided attention of their parents or guardians. They have no peer conflicts inside the home. What I mean is that if you're an only child and you put down a toy and leave the house, when you return, it will be wherever you left it, or at worst, your mother or father will have tidied it away. It will not be missing or broken. I went to friends and cousins' houses when I was young and was amused and even appalled at the casual fights over using or borrowing each other's stuff. And that is wonderful and important training for conflict in the real world, training that is absent by default in the life of an only child. I could go on about this at length because I've lived and studied the phenomenon of being an only child. For example, it's a proven fact that most only kids end up reading a lot more than average, or at least that was the case before the internet. I suspect there's a whole lot more online gaming in the last 20 years. Almost all home time is quiet time. So I read and I read and I read. I read everything, which is not some kind of casual flex to say, hey, look, I've absorbed everything, I'm extra smart. Obviously not. I mean, listen to me, not in the slightest. I'm good at table quizzes and I was decent at school, and I think I properly excelled at one subject once, which is another story that's just too boring to tell. But for every negative aspect of being an only child, there is a huge plus. In the vast majority of cases, only kids learn to build a network of very strong bonds outside the home, intensely strong relationships in some cases that are very diverse and very important. And they do this very quickly too. Now, I'm interested in everyone and I love knowing people, and I'm beyond lucky to have a core set of friends who I regard as if they're my brothers and sisters. With that said, I also know that blood is thicker than water, but I broadly know that the feeling is mutual. I'd even go so far as to guess that I know or have a good or even great relationship with about 200 people listening to this podcast, which is probably about 2% of the audience, 10,000 listeners. The only other time when you know more than 2% of an audience is the first gig you play with your band when all your friends come. So anyway, this brings me to my point. One such close friendship was formed in my mid-teens in my hometown with a guy my own age. I'm not asking his permission to tell this story, just as you wouldn't bother asking your sister or brother if you can tell a childhood tale. You'd know where the line is and you'd stay inside it. So I won't use his real name. Instead, I'll call him Mark. Mark is smart and very funny. He came from an absurdly wealthy home by traditional Irish standards. But that didn't matter a tot to Mark or me. We were at an age where neither of us had anything, and just because his folks had millions didn't mean he did. It reminds me of the expression, I was born with nothing and I still have most of it left. Well, that was him when we were 20. We had nothing, but somehow managed to head out every night to spend it. He and I had the laugh of laughs in the summer of 1995, which just seemed to last forever. It was a really hot summer in Dublin, and we were footloose and fancy-free, as the old saying goes. At that time, he was studying business in UCD, and I was studying physics in DCU. As I think about it, actually, we both had good summer jobs in 95 that paid well, which I think for the most part was handed over to the Gibney family in Malahide Village. Gibney's is a pub, by the way. So Mark was born into a family that had homes, luxury homes in several locations, and more assets than even I know about. Whereas I was born into a home with more than enough, but not a lot. I'd regard it as a normal, middle-of-the-road Irish household. At the end of that summer, which was the start of the new college year, I told Mark about this thing called the internet. We sat in my house and really delved into it because he had an exam or a project or something on the future of business, which I figured was the web. It might have been on his curriculum, but either way, I sketched out for Mark how it worked and what it did. Then, about 3 years later, in around 1998, I mentioned Amazon.com stock to Mark, which neither of us at that time ended up buying. It was actually Mark who reminded me about these conversations not too long ago. So the years rolled by and we went our separate ways. He spent the next 18 years or something in finance before setting up his own company, and I followed my path before starting MyWallSt in and around the same time. It's not unusual for us to not speak for years, but I think we were connected in that way, like, as I said, brothers are. If you're my age, you'll relate to that, not seeing or chatting with a dear friend for years. It's just the way it goes when you get married and have kids. Today, Mark has a long roster of very high net worth clients or ultra high net worth clients. Don't ask me what's the difference. People with a long string of zeros in their bank account. Someone said to me that he has influence over billions. And I've no doubt he's good at his job because he didn't just learn how to deal with wealth. He lived it for as long as he's been sentient. So about 9 months ago, we met for lunch. Before heading into the restaurant, I hopped into his new mega luxury car for a look. And in seconds flat, we were just laughing at the same jokes that we had in his first car 30 years earlier. The new car was nice, but it was as if we just stepped out of his Volkswagen Golf age 18 and straight into his new supercar age 48. Our mood was the same. We know each other. We know about each other's stories, high points and struggles from when we were kids and very young adults, and we just accept each other for who we are. Anyway, after a quick spin where he just floored and braked the car over and over to show me how powerful it was because he's a complete kid, we went into the restaurant where our conversation turned to investing. It's what we both do. It's where our paths appeared to converge once again. Now wait, over lunch, this messer started to pitch Amazon stock to me. And I took from the wider conversation that he would not be into investing in the same way as I am, as in, we are poles apart. I was like, Amazon, have you been hit on the head or something? Have you lost your memory? But I let him go on because I could hear that he was not really talking to me. He was talking to a client. We were in his restaurant and I knew from his look that I was getting a tape recording of sorts. When I left him and I was in my car driving home, I was feeling a little nettled because I didn't think he was overly interested in MyWallSt, or more, he didn't like or agree with something targeting our audience with what it is that we do. I know him too well. And then the words from a dear friend of mine in New York who has worked on Wall Street his entire adult life came ringing back. Brian Ruan told me in passing when I first met him in his office in number 1 Wall Street that the skills required to create wealth are entirely different to the skills required to keep it. The skills required to create wealth are entirely different to the skills required to keep it. It dawned on me that my lifelong friend is programmed to protect wealth. Don't lose it. And any growth needs to come with a high degree of certainty. I, on the other hand, I go high risk. I've dedicated a huge portion of my life to land as many 1998 Amazons as possible. I can tell you with 95% certainty, 99% certainty, that Mark has never heard of CRISPR and wouldn't invest in it under any circumstances, despite it looking to me like the medical equivalent to the internet in 1996. No more than he'd invest in an insurance disruptor position to completely upend the retail insurance world, or a breakthrough in cancer testing and prevention, or a grocery store chain in Poland. The things I seek out and not only get behind, but tell others about too. I've had a couple of 100 baggers, but in the next 30 years, I will land more than I've had to date. I expect I'll have 3 or 4 more. 30 years is my new intended retirement point. I hope to give this 30 years more because it's just in my DNA. What I do is no longer work. I think about this pursuit of wealth creation through stock investing 365 days and nights a year. I don't go to Switzerland for conferences with Julius Baer or whoever, or send the guts of $1 billion a year to Morgan Stanley for high yield instruments. I have, however, had some outrageous winners in my investing life, up tens of thousands of percentage points, and hundreds of stocks that were losers, with the net result being outsized returns when you look at 10-year blocks. Mine and Mark's approaches are not completely binary, but they nearly are. Most people spend, let's say, the first 30 years of adulthood trying to better themselves with their careers with a few higher risk investments, and the last 20 or 30 years preserving the fruits of their working lives, career over, and with as little risk as possible. The skills required to create wealth are entirely different to the skills required to keep it. You can't figure how to protect millions until you've got them. Finally, one of those two modes of wealth, creation and protection, is far more fun than the other. I'd rather spend a night in a town with a bunch of people trying to better their situation than those looking to protect it. Think about that and know where you sit. You probably don't need to think too hard. You are where you're at. Okay, I can't believe I managed to talk for 14 minutes and counting on my own. I'm going to leave it there. If you enjoyed this, let me know and hit me up for ideas for this podcast's name. Next time, if I do it, I'll talk about antithesis. That's the prompt. I have some good stuff to tell you on that particular theme. All the best from Porto. Stay well, my friends. Talk to you soon.
Anne-Marie, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm inspired by the soliloquy that just preceded us.
It was, well, I'm not an only child, so I feel like I can't add anything to it. You're not an only child, are you?
No, I love the one-man show where it's going to slowly develop. Do you ever see the one-man show Buskers? And he's got like a drum on his back, and he's got a foot snare and the harmonica and the guitar. Yeah. So that's how this podcast is going to develop. Emmet slowly but surely becomes a full one-man band.
Yeah, perfect. And he'll record each segment. I would like it if he did voices. I think it would be nice if he had a conversation with himself, like different versions of himself. I think that would be kind of cool. Like
if he did the intro music, like a cappella.
Yes.
I hope he's listening to this. I'm not Perfect. Sure. I'm not sure if Emmet listens to the podcast, but if he is, we've got some good ideas for him.
Wow. I didn't think of the intro music at all. That is so good. He plays the guitar, to be fair.
I know,
he probably could do a few riffs. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So we're just going to come in. We'll cover a few of the biggest stories from the last week and a half, really. So yeah, just do a big deal or no big deal, and we'll fly through them. So where are we going first?
I think you are going to talk about Starbucks for us.
Yes.
They have just ousted their CEO, and they're replacing him with the current CEO of Chipotle, who's had quite a successful year to 2 years, Brian Niccol. Big deal or no big deal?
Yeah, huge deal. Like just in general to see like some genuine poaching going on, some kind of black market dealings, very Succession-esque. You can imagine the kind of meetings that went on to land Brian Niccol and how pissed off Chipotle were about it all happening. So yeah, definitely big deal in terms of drama, but also big deal. The market reacted hugely. Starbucks was up 25% yesterday, I think, on the news.
Yeah. And when you have a massive market cap, that's a big move.
That's a big move. It was worth I think he's worth like $15 or $20 billion in market cap in one day. And then on the other side of it, then Chipotle fell. I think it closed the day down about 8%, but it fell much more. At one point, I think it was down 14 or 15%. So, So he's got maybe $15 on the way up in Starbucks, and then another 10 coming down on Chipotle in the one day. $25 billion man. It's not a bad title.
There you go.
But
that would do things to your ego. You know, you'd be like, I moved from one company to the next, the stock went up 25%.
Yeah. Oof. And we're going to feed his ego even more here because he's been a very impressive CEO. He was originally at Yum Brands. He took over Taco Bell, and then he moved to Chipotle after that in 2018. So he actually came in basically just after the E. coli outbreak.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So he kind of was tasked with steering this turnaround and rebuilding the brand, rebuilding market equity amongst its customers who got really sick from eating at a restaurant. You know, that could be the death knell for a lot of companies. He also then went from that, kind of brought it back to its feet and beyond. And then COVID hit. And through all of that, in the space of 2018 to 2024, so about 6 years, the stock is up. The stock was up nearly ninefold throughout his tenure, which is seriously impressive, especially considering the circumstances he was dealt with: COVID, global pandemic, E. coli outbreak. I suppose he didn't have that during his tenure. And I guess the timing is pretty good as well, in terms of he came in right as the bottom kicked in, basically, from the E. coli stuff, but still, it is really, really impressive. And it's the one restaurant stock that's kind of been bulletproof. We talked about it 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago, they had that fantastic earnings report, blew it out of the water.
Yeah, so like every other restaurant stock is seeing a pullback. It's no surprise Starbucks is going to look for a guy like this. So yeah, I think it's a cool story. I love the poaching. I love the succession style of it. I can just imagine how much money Starbucks is paying him to take him away from Chipotle. Yeah, because it's definitely a more challenging role. I don't know if there's as much low hanging fruit, we'll say. Like he came in and he really developed Chipotle's digital sales. Now they have these Chipotlanes, which is digital order pickup only, and like it's just really increased the efficiency of each shop. Starbucks already had so much of the digital stuff in place. I mean, their Starbucks loyalty program and their points and all the rest. I think apparently, though, it's actually been a pain point in recent years in terms of kind of the efficiency of a shop. So digital order pickups are messing up the queue and all that. So like bringing in something like the Chipotlanes for Starbucks could work. But in general, like we've got Starbucks is really suffering because of slowing Chinese market. He's never had to deal with that at Chipotle. Do you know what I mean? Chipotle is almost entirely in the US. So there's definitely more challenges involved. And it'll be interesting to see how he gets on. I think it's a very harsh treatment of the outgoing CEO, Laxman Narasimhan. He was Howard Schultz's pick, but it seemed the board was fairly set out against him from the jump. Basically, he didn't have any restaurant experience, which could be fair enough. You know, I won't get the violins out from him. He's probably on an 8-figure retirement severance package. So yeah, look, I don't know. Clearly the stock suffered hugely under his tenure. I think he was there for almost a little over a year. Stock severely overperformed at that time. I think he revised down guidance twice in the last couple of quarters. So yeah. Oh, and there's one more nugget to the story as well. So Elliott Management, the active investors we're always talking about.
Oh yeah.
So they built a $2 billion stake in Starbucks recently, but the board didn't tell them a thing about this leadership change until after the fact. So more Succession-esque elements to this story. So yeah, overall, I think this is a really interesting story. Should be really big for Starbucks. Chipotle should suffer. Just losing talent like that, it's very hard to replace. He's kind of established himself as the top restaurant or QSR CEO. So yeah, that's it. I big deal. What have you been looking at? You have, you're taking on the Google federal case. So basically they've been judged to have been maintaining an anti-competitive monopoly. This is all from paying Apple, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's kind of where it stems from. There's actually a couple of those deals in the works where Google pays essentially to maintain its status as the default search engine. But it's been kind of interesting because it's more wide-reaching than that. So the federal judge, his name is actually Judge Mehta, which is funny. He ruled on August 5th that Google has illegally maintained a monopoly over general online search services and some of the ads actually that it runs in search results. He broadly agrees with the government that Google has built, and this is a quote, a cycle of dominance that has stopped rivals from building new innovations and allowed it to raise ad prices beyond what would be possible within a free market structure. And at the center of this is that $20 billion payment that they make almost annually to Apple to maintain its status as a default search engine. But it makes similar payments to Mozilla to remain default search on Firefox as well. So it's something that, you know, when you have a lot of money to play with, you can build that kind of competitive moat, or I suppose a legal competitive moat at this point. Is it a big deal? I think is going to come down to two considerations. Number one, obviously, Google's already come right out the gate and said, we will be fighting this decision. We will be looking for an appeal. So we are gonna have to wait. I actually think, in terms of the outlook, like, I think the federal government is probably going to win in the end, because they've gone through a couple rounds of this now, and most of the judges, once they kind of see all the information, they do seem to be like, well, yeah, like, this is anti-competitive behavior. This is monopolistic behavior. So then from there, we kind of have to talk about, okay, what could the federal government do to Google, to kind of rein it in? And, we could be looking at a couple of punishments. There's been no official decisions yet. We have had a couple of leaks come out from the research teams. And the number one big scary headline that we keep seeing is the breaking up of Google. I don't think it'll be like a complete liquidation of all the various wings and they'll all be spun off and forced to be independent. But the big one is maybe Chrome or Android will be forced to be sold. That was highlighted by the judge as being one of the key parts of how Google is able to maintain its dominance within the search market. The second one would maybe be forcing Google to divest away from its search ad tools or spinning that off into an independent company. So then at least, you're not owning both the ads and the search engine. And kind of beyond that, we've heard from DuckDuckGo, which I suppose would be the most well-known small competitor of Google, which is its own independent search engine.
Privacy-based browser, is that correct?
Yeah. Their whole thing is like, oh, we don't use cookies. We, help encrypt all your data. They're kind of seen as the responsible underdog, I suppose. They put out a really interesting letter a couple of days ago, basically saying, hey, like, we operate in this field. Here are things that we think would actually be useful if you were going to break up Google or try and regulate them in some way. And these included things like the government banning the agreements that made Google's search engine the default option on a number of platforms and devices, giving others access to Google's search and ads knowledge, basically taking away their kind of long-standing knowledge advantage, present screens that allow people to change search engines easily and educate the public about the process of picking a new search engine and kind of helping like with a pros and cons argument. I think a lot of people just use Google because they're not really familiar with any other competitor. So maybe just being told, hey, this is what Google does with your data. If you're not comfortable with that, there are alternatives. And then finally, and most importantly, and this is something I agreed with, DuckDuckGo said, it's very, very important that you provide supervision by an independent body of technical experts to ensure compliance with whatever the government ends up deciding. And I think this is really key because I remember when researching the Ticketmaster and Live Nation merger several years ago, the big thing that allowed that to go through in 2010 was that the government put a number of stipulations within the deal. And they said, like, you have to follow these rules. And it was a lot of like, you're not allowed to share data between the two companies and blah, blah, blah. The issue is when that went through, the government really didn't have any kind of monitoring ability within a technical company. So it was something crazy. Like within 3 months of the merger going through, they were already in violation of most of the agreed stipulations. So I think, this is kind of going to be a new age for the federal government if they're going to go forward with this, where they have to realize, okay, if we're going to regulate big tech, we need to have expertise within big tech who can actually mandate these rules. So I'm very interested. I think it could be a big deal for Google. I'd say a lot of this monopoly has meant that Google doesn't innovate all that often. We've been talking about it recently. Hey, they added AI to search. Is it actually improving the product? So I think this is maybe going to be a bit of a make or break for Google search. But I would say that the timeline in this is pretty long. The federal government doesn't move all that fast. So, maybe a 5-year turnaround period. But really interested, and I'll be paying attention.
Yeah, but didn't Apple come out and say, like, we're not using another browser, whatever happens, like, we love Google kind of thing? So
yeah,
it's easy to love the company that's giving you 20 billion quid a year. But I don't know. We'll see. I kind of lost faith with all these federal decisions when it comes to big tech because they seem very... I don't know. Wishy-washy. They don't seem to have a lot of teeth anytime. There's always the threat of, we'll break up big tech. And Google was always the one because it has so many elements that are so, they have so much synergies between the ads and the search and all the rest. And like they're getting a huge advantage from the ad marketplace being so closely attached to Google search or Google Maps or YouTube or whatever else. But I don't know. We'll see. I think the fact that this comes at a time when OpenAI is like, we want to launch a search engine as well, it might put shivers up them, but I'll see. I'll believe it when I see it.
Yeah, that is kind of my feeling as well. One of my points I wrote down is I was thinking, well, it needs to be some kind of sophisticated regulation beyond finding, which tends to be what most governments go with. Oh, 15, $20 billion, pay it. We'll see again in 2 or 3 years. I think
they just send the $20 billion earmarked for Apple. They just send it to the federal government and Apple continues on.
Basically, yeah. So I think if there's going to be any impact, it can't be a fine, and it's going to be it has to be like quite a sophisticated overhaul, and that responsibility is going to fall in the hands of the government. I mean, Biden is a big regulation administration. Maybe the election will affect it as well, like what the government is focusing on in terms of regulation. So yeah, one to watch, but a long-term one to watch, I suppose.
Yeah.
All right. Heading back over to you, it was an interesting week for the weight loss drug market. Novo Nordisk missed earnings, which is crazy. Biggest company in Europe, has that, big product. While Eli Lilly blew past expectations. Big deal or no big deal?
Yeah. Potentially a big deal. I know that's not nailing my mast to anything, but yeah, so this happened last week. That's why I said a week and a half in the intro there. But it's a topic we covered before, and I just find it to be a really interesting story, especially the one that could be developing. And there's a lot of supposition and speculation behind that as well. But we mentioned a few months back, me and you, we talked about our GLP. Was it me and you or me, Emmet? Talked about our GLP-1s, yeah. And just the sheer demand for these weight loss drugs is just off the charts because the amount of applicable people that could be taking them. So Novo Nordisk was the first that came out with Ozempic and Wegovy. So Ozempic would be the diabetes specific, which you can also use for weight loss. And then Wegovy is just weight loss. Then Eli Lilly came second, but it came with more efficient drugs. So it came out with Mounjaro, which is the Ozempic equivalent, and then Zepbound, which is only out for the last 2 quarters, I think. But by all accounts, it is just this miracle drug, a more efficient weight loss drug than all the rest. The best yet, we'll say. These companies can't state demand. That's what we centered most of the conversation around last time, was like a company like Hims and Hers can offer what's called compound products. So we're not talking about that now, but that's kind of the overall picture. But when we're talking about Novo Nordisk, basically, they missed estimates on Ozempic sales, they missed estimates on Wegovy sales, and they revised down their profit forecast for the year because of it. So it's still suffering from supply constraints, which basically means, we can't make it fast enough for the people who want to buy it, which is a great issue to have. And Eli Lilly is in the same boat. But the day after that, Eli Lilly then hammered all earnings expectations. Zepbound in particular was the fastest growing GLP-1 treatment out there, and it really, really overperformed. So with Zepbound proven to be more efficient than anything Novo is currently offering, while competition, it's not playing fully out yet in terms of the market hasn't fully formed. Do you know what I mean? The supply side is so much lower than the demand that both companies are going to grow irrelevant in the near term. But long term, what's going to happen here? Is Eli Lilly going to eclipse Novo Nordisk, even though Novo Nordisk had the first mover advantage? And even though Ozempic has a huge market share right now, will Zepbound or Mounjaro eat away at that? And those competitive forces come into play more and more as the years go on, and as this market develops, and as the demand we foresee, does that come to the fore? And as if it is finally stated, how will it play out then? So there's a lot of questions involved. We know how valuable this is. It's kind of shaken the pharmaceutical industry just in terms of how valuable it is. So yeah, like long term, is Novo Nordisk going to lose ground? Amgen and Roche have both very promising drugs in production. What will that happen? How will that affect the market? Which of any of them will be the first to nail the oral pill rather than an injection? And how long is demand going to outweigh supply? So say Hims and Hers is kind of on a limited timeline in terms of how long it can offer these compounded drugs. But if the market demand keeps growing faster than the supply, that could kind of go out indefinitely. So there's lots of unanswered questions. It is like a tug of war here between Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk, and it does seem like Eli Lilly is winning at the minute. So yeah, I think this is a fascinating market and it's just worth talking about. So I thought those two earnings reports back to back were worth mentioning here.
Yeah, fair.
Yeah. Okay. Last one. So, and we'll finish up is, yes, Warren Buffett. So he sold 510 million shares of Apple last week. He reduced Berkshire Hathaway's stake by about 50%. Big deal or no big deal?
Mm-hmm. I would say no big deal. Big deal if you like to produce clickbait headlines, which every big financial news agency had I think 3 or 4 articles come out about this. But actually, when you kind of look into the numbers, it seems to be all right. You're correct there. He sold 510 million shares, which is the equivalent to $59 billion.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be nice? Side note, that means his tax bill is estimated to be about $15 billion, which is more than Coca-Cola made last year. So free school lunches, everybody. The suddenness, obviously, of the exit is, I think, what kind of caught people off guard. It seemed like, he holds all this Apple stock, and he has spoken quite favorably of Apple in the past. He was with Tim Cook like 6 or 9 months ago and had a big meeting with him, and it was actually to warn Tim Cook, hey, I'm thinking about selling some of my Apple stock. But I think he still views Apple as favorable. I think he just was like, this position has become far too large in the grand scheme of the portfolio. So just kind of put some numbers around that. The sale raised Berkshire's cash holding from 189 billion to 278 billion. And the reason everybody's talking about that is because it's a record. Berkshire has never held so much cash before, $278 billion. However, if you look at cash versus total holdings ratio, Berkshire is not that far off where it typically is. So it currently has a 17.5% cash position, which is a bit higher than normal, but it typically is sitting between 13 and 14% cash. And it's been like that since about 1997. So I do think it's a rebalancing effort. That being said, Apple continues to represent about 40% of the Berkshire portfolio. That's after the sale.
Yeah.
So
this was the
I
thing,
would just say,
it was slowly developing for a long time where, buying shares in Berkshire Hathaway is basically like buying shares in Apple.
Basically, yeah. And I think Warren was just like if we were an individual investor and you had the great fortune picking up, a stock and it had grown substantially and it was like a massive percentage of your portfolio, anyone would go, hey, maybe I should be rebalancing here. And if Warren is looking to have a bit of cash because he's waiting to find another buy or, he's looking to diversify in some way, it makes sense that you would cash out of your largest holdings. So, I don't think it's any warning signs for Berkshire or the economy, or I don't think it's a warning sign for Apple. I mean, back in May, what did he say? He said, Coca-Cola and American Express are wonderful businesses, but he said that Apple may be an even better one. So, I don't think he's had a major kind of change in terms of how he feels about the company. And just an interesting side note as well, with some of this cash that he had, Buffett repurchased about $5 billion worth of Berkshire shares. And he said on the decision that with our present mix of businesses, Berkshire should do a bit better than the average American corporation in the coming year. So there you go. I think he's just rebalancing, getting a bit of cash, reinvesting in his own business.
And buying every T-bond known to man. I think he owns more government bonds than the federal government. I saw that headline this week.
Yeah, he does. He definitely is rotating, rebalancing, going into slower moving stuff. But I'm not worried about it.
No, I wouldn't be either. And it's true when you see the headline, and that came at a very volatile time in general. So that came out right after a really slow McDonald's report. And it carried through to the weekend, and we had that yen carry trade mess. And so it all kind of formed into this perfect storm of what the hell is going on? Are we going into recession? Blah, blah, blah. And there's a bit of fear mongering and fear sells, which is an unfortunate reality of financial reporting in general. So just a general rebalance of, to be honest, he should have been rebalancing for ages. His portfolio was kind of messy for the greatest investor ever. It's just 60% Apple shares.
Yeah, I mean, he's been riding the wave of Apple. I think the initial investment was 7 or 8 years ago. And to be fair, he did a great job, because I think even 7 or 8 years ago, people would have been saying, oh, maybe it's a bit too late to buy Apple. Yeah. But more, Warren liked what he saw and put the money in, and he's had a fantastic return on the investment. But I think if I was holding Berkshire, I think I'd feel even more comfortable. I'd be like, oh yeah, he's just recharging and getting ready to go after something else. So yeah.
Yeah. And that's the thing with Warren Buffett. If you look at historically, his winning bets have all been huge swings.
Yeah.
So he took a massive punt on Apple Bank of America after 2008, 2009, the GFC, Coca-Cola back in the day, and then like Geico and Seas Candy and all the rest. Mm-hmm. Like we always try to prophesize of what's he going to do next. He's got 300 billion in cash. Is he going to buy? And then is he going to buy Airbnb 3 times or whatever else? And
yeah,
I don't know. Like, I'd say he's happy to sit on 5% for now and buy up T-bonds. Yeah. So yeah, we'll see. Like, it's not exciting. We'd love to come in and talk and earmark 3 companies he go buy, and we might do that, but the reality probably isn't close to that at the minute. All right, that's it for today's show. Anne-Marie, thank you for joining, and Emmet, if you are listening, thank you for your one-man show. I'm sure it'll only develop over the coming months. Remember, everyone else, thanks for listening as well. Remember to get 20% off any of our products. Just use the code StockClub20 at checkout. That offer is across the board. Invest Plus, Horizon, even Nexus. 20% off right now with the code StockClub20. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll talk to you next week.